In programming, it is often useful to have a way of repeating a set of instructions a certain number of times or until a certain condition is met. So just repeating instructions. And that's the topic of this tutorial today. We're going to look at a type of loop called a for loop and a while loop. So starting with the for loop. So a for loop is a way of repeating instructions a certain number of times, a known number of times essentially. So if I want to repeat a set of instructions 10 times, I can do so using a for loop. So the way a for loop works is it has a variable which is called usually a counter or a stepper variable, or using common names such as count or counter, these kind of things, which starts at a particular value, and each time around the loop it increments itself by a number such as 1 up until it gets to another value. So we'll look at an example to make it clear. So I'm going to go for counter in range. So I'm looking at the variable called counter. It starts at 0, it goes up by 1, and it stops at 10. And that's the syntax I'm using. And then I say print counter. So let's take a look at what's happening here. At first counter is 0, print 0. And then it increases by 1, so it becomes 1, and then it prints 1, then it prints 2, then 3, and so on. So each time around the loop, this variable called counter is incrementing itself by 1, up until 10, but not including 10. So it goes from 0 to 9 actually, in steps of 1. So if I look at a second for loop here, for counter in range 25, 50, so starting at 25, going up to but not including 50, and going up in steps of 2, print counter. Let's see what happens. So starting at 25, then it increments by 2 next time around the loop to 27, then 29, all the way up to 49, but stopping before it gets to 50. So it's repeating a certain number of times depending on its start value, its end value, which we want to reach, and essentially the step it goes up, or it increments by each time around the loop, each time the loop is repeated. Now I'm going to look at a string variable. Let's just say my string equals, this string is 28 characters long, and it just happens to be the case. So I've got another variable. Instead of counter, I'm just going to say index or something. For index in range, so I want to start at 0, and I want to go up to the length of my string. So starting at 0, going up to the length of my string and going up in increments of 1, the index variable is going to increment in this for loop. You notice at first I haven't put in the 0 and 1 because they're just default values, they're assumed, but we can put them in anyway, as we're going to do now. So let's have index starting at 0, stopping at length of my string, and going up to 1, going up in increments of 1 each time around the loop. I'm going to print a particular character of my string, which is defined by the number that index has. So the first time around the loop, we're going to print out my string, square brackets, index 0, and that's going to print out the capital T from this. And then we're going to go index 1, which is H, and then index I, which has the character I, index 3 rather, which has the character I, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, up until the end of the string. So each time around the loop, we have an index variable that increments by 1, which represents the position of a particular character in this loop. So if I look at that, if I look at the example again, but instead printing the index, we would see it's just a normal 0 all the way up until 27. Now we're going to program a slightly longer or bigger program essentially, using the concept of the for loop which we've looked at so far. So I'm going to write a bigger program, so a new file, and I'll save it as something like loops.py, like I have. So I'm going to start off by printing in this program, asking the user to essentially enter two numbers, and using the procedures we've looked at in previous tutorials, I'm just going to get those two numbers, num1 and num2. So essentially the aim of this program is for the user to enter two different numbers, one that's large and one that's big, and then the program to work out which one's the biggest and the largest. We've seen that before as well. And now using the for loop, what I want the program to do is start at the smallest number and going up to the largest number, print all of the values within that range between the smallest and the biggest, all of the numbers that are divisible by a particular number like 11. So I'll start off again. Print, enter two different integer numbers, and I'll tell you all of the numbers between them that are divisible by 11. So I take in num1, and we're familiar with this procedure, int input. So get an input, but instead of treating it as a string, treat it as an integer or number, and then exactly the same for number 2. Int input num2, and that looks good. Remembering to close each set of brackets that you open, that's really important, otherwise the program might not run. So the next thing I want to do is look at number 1 and number 2 and see which one of the two is bigger. So establish smaller and larger, essentially. That's what we want to do. So we've taken in the inputs, now we want to see which one's bigger and which one's larger. So I'm just going to write this comment, find out which one's bigger and which one's larger, just for my reference, for the programmer's reference. It's really good to write comments. These comments have no effect on how the code runs itself anyway. So let's look at an if statement. If num1 is more than num2, colon, and remember to indent the sequence of instructions that you want to carry out. So if it happens to be that num1 is larger, I'm just going to have another variable called largest, or larger. That will do. Larger equals num1. Else larger, if num1 is more than num2, I want larger to be num1 and smaller to be num2. So essentially set the variables larger and smaller to whichever one's larger and smaller. And it's exactly the same in the else statement, apart from it's the opposite number. So larger is set to number 2 and smaller is set to number 1. So now we've established two variables, smaller and larger. So a smaller number and a larger number. Now the next part of our program is to go through all of the numbers between this range, and then after going through each one we want to check, or as we go through each one we want to check divisibility by 11. So I'm going to go for another for statement, a for loop. So for counting range, let's look at the variable count. I want it to start at the smaller number, stop at the larger number, and go up in steps of 1. So that's what I want the for loop to do, and how the count variable should increment. And within this for loop, so each time this loop repeats itself, I'm going to say if count, if this number is divisible by 11, i.e. the remainder from division is 0, then print this number is divisible by 11. This particular number is divisible by 11. So just to go over that again, look at the for loop. Count starts at smaller, goes up to the larger number, and goes up in steps of 1. And each time the loop is executed, we check that the number is divisible by 11, and if so, we'll print out this particular number is divisible by 11. And if that's not the case, we have else, and we print that the number count is not divisible by 11. So let's just finish that print statement. Count, comma, is not divisible by 11. And that's our for loop done. Let's see what happens when we run this program. So here's what I've got on the screen. Enter two different integer numbers and so on. We've seen this print statement. It just gives us the message. So we'll ask for number 1 and then we'll be asked for number 2. So let's just go for 240 for number 1. Number 2, let's go for 398, 400, whatever it might be. So I want to find out which one's the smaller number between 240 and 390, and then the program will find out which one's smaller and bigger, and the for loop will take count from the smaller number all the way up to the bigger number, so 240 all the way up to 390, or stopping just before, and checking each number is divisible by 11. And we see a lot of numbers that it's processed here in a very short amount of time. So it's just gone through each one and just checked if it's divisible by 11 or not, and printed out the right statement accordingly, whichever one's divisible. And that's our program. In this program, I want to do exactly the same thing as before, but using a different type of loop called a while loop. So you'll see here exactly the same code, but I've commented out using the hashtag all of the for loop we mentioned before. So we looked at the structure of a for loop, which has a variable like a count or a step or something like that, which starts at a particular value, stops at a particular value, and goes up or down in particular increments each time around the loop. Now the way the while loop works is we have a condition, and each time around the loop Python checks that that condition is true, and as long as it's true it will repeat the instructions within the loop, indented within the loop. And we're going to see an example of this. So we're going to do exactly the same thing. So we've got a larger and a smaller number. We want to go from the smaller number all the way up to the larger number, or we could do the other way around, larger to smaller. And for each value we want to check divisibility by 11. So again, as I said, I've commented out all of the for loop, and I'm just going to write the same thing but in a while loop now. So a good place to start is have your count variable, or counter or count, whatever you want to call it, and I'm just going to set it to smaller for now. Now I'm going to start writing my while loop. So while count is less than larger, i.e. while we still haven't got to the final number, the larger number yet, I'm going to copy and paste this code actually from the previous loop. I'm going to do this particular body of code, and it's the same thing. It's just checking that the division by 11 gives us a remainder of 0. If so, we know that it's divisible by 11, the number, and if not, this particular number is not divisible by 11. So it's the same thing, but this time we declare count outside of the loop, and remember, each time we go around the loop, count, we want it to increase by 1. So we say count equals count plus 1. We reassign the value of count so that it increases by 1 each time around the loop. So we start off at smaller and stop when count is equal to or more than larger. And that's the way the program will work. We're going to try it out now. So we can see here exactly the same thing. The program, or Python in fact, asks us for two different integer numbers. So number 1, I'm going to say 23, and number 2, let's mix it up here, let's go for a minus 23. So we're going to go from minus 23. The while loop has count starting at minus 23, and each time around the loop it increases count by 1, as we can see here. So it goes up to minus 22, minus 21, and so on. And each time around the loop we're checking a divisibility by 11. If so, print out that it's divisible by 11. If not, then print out that it's not accordingly. So each time around the loop, it's doing exactly the same thing as a for loop. It's just the structure of our loop is a bit different. That's all it is.